During this project, we're going to use some personal sketches to create a composite in Photoshop or Photopea. We'll break the foreground, middle ground, background up, make adjustments to them, and then we'll get into color restoration. I hope you enjoy it. So we're going to continue our composite concept, and I want to go through a few concepts with you in arranging a different type of composition. So again, go to photopea.com and we're going to go to File, New, and we'll set the size of our document in inches. The width will be 11, the height will be 14, as these will be printed out in that size. And we're going to start with importing a background. Now this background can be from a photograph that you put a filter on. It can be from a painting perhaps that you have, or a drawing. It can be a tiny little thumbnail sketch that you sketch by sight or just out of your head, or if you have a small perspective drawing, that would work just fine. But I'm going to go to File, and let's go ahead and click Open and Place, and I'm going to select this background that I created using an X-Acto knife on mat board, and I went in and tore some areas up to hold value, these areas that are dark or a little bit rougher, and I just took some oil paint and kind of rubbed all over the composition. And as I wiped the mat board down, all those areas that had texture that were peeled up ended up being darker than the areas that weren't, that were just regular mat board. So I'm going to go ahead and use that for my background, and let's talk about I guess enhancing this background a little bit, just so it will bring a little bit more interest to the piece. So with the background layer selected, I'm going to go up to Layer and go down to Rasterize and rasterize that smart object. And again, when you're working with layers, make sure that whatever layer you're working with is highlighted. So I'm going to go ahead and resize this background a little bit to stretch it out to meet the size of my paper. As you can see with this move tool, it's a little bit small. So to do that, we go to Edit, Transform, Scale. The bounding box will show up around it, and I can go ahead and stretch this out. Now I'm going to distort it a little bit. I'm going to stretch it to meet that 11 by 14 size, and then I can go ahead and crop it down to cut off any extra parts of the image that I have left. So I stretched it out, hit the marquee tool to place it, and I'm going to use that marquee tool to just highlight the 11 by 14 area, and then I'll go to Image and Crop, and that will crop off the sides of that layer. Okay, so the other thing that I want to do is get rid of any color. So if you have a painting and you don't anticipate using those colors in your composition, the easiest way to do that is to go to Image Adjustments and go down to Black and White, and that will make this black and white. So I'll click OK, and I want to create a little bit more depth in this picture plane, so I'm going to go ahead and separate the three planes that you see in the composition. There's a foreground up here with these rock structures and the grass, and then there's this area of emphasis, which is this tilting rock that's in the middle ground, and then our background is basically this the skyline where the sky meets the ground, the horizon line. So I'm going to take that background, I'm going to go ahead and cut that out, and we can do that in a few different ways, but I'm just going to go ahead and use let's use the magnetic lasso tool. So I'm going to click that, start over here on the left hand side, and kind of start to go around my composition and select everything that is background. So I went around the middle ground there and separated that whole background. So what I'm going to do with that is, since I have that all selected, I'm going to go up here and I'm going to go Edit, Copy, and Edit, Paste. That way I have the background itself, or the sky, on this layer 1. So I'm going to go ahead and click where it says layer 1 and type in sky. Now I'm going to go back to this background layer, and I'm going to select the foreground. That way the middle ground essentially will become the background. I'll list it if that sounds confusing. I'm going to go ahead and use the magnetic lasso again. And I'm going to start on the left-hand side, and this time I'm just going to select the things that are closest to me in the picture plane, or this little rock formation that essentially is up front and leads the viewer's eye into the picture plane. So I'm just going to define it as, I guess, this area right here. And I'll be kind of sloppy with this just to kind of go through it. Okay, now the foreground is selected, so I'm going to copy and paste that too. So I'll go to Edit, Copy, Edit, Paste, and where it says Layer 1, I'll consider that the foreground. And I'm going to switch this from background to middle ground. So I have these three planes, and I'm going to paste, since this is a composite, another image into it, but let me get my background adjusted first. So I'm going to go up to the sky, and I'm going to try to push the sky back a bit. So with sky selected, the sky layer selected, I'm going to go up to Filter and go down to Blur, and we're going to use Gaussian blur. And what Gaussian blur will do is it'll basically blur that whole area out, and it'll push it back into space. You can go like crazy blurry like this, and you can't really tell what's what, but I'm going to go ahead and tone it down a bit. Just so it looks like those textures are being pushed back behind that middle ground. So I have the foreground up front, a middle ground, and again the sky is the background. I'm going to select this middle ground, and I'll put a little bit less Gaussian blur on it. So for the sky, again I went to Filter, Blur, Gaussian blur, and that's set at 7.2. So I'm going to go to the middle ground, and I'm going to turn it down a little bit, but I'll still use that Gaussian blur on there just a touch. So I'll blur it down just a little bit. And then the foreground, obviously that remains in focus. So let me go ahead, and I'm going to drag that foreground on top of the middle ground so that you can see that a little bit better. So when I take a look at the foreground, when I turn this foreground on and off, you can see that that's in pretty good focus up front. Then the middle ground has that, I guess, 1 pixel blur, and then we have 7 in the background. So that gives us a little bit more depth within the picture plane. The next thing I'm going to do is, so that I don't get confused, I'm going to bring in my main area of emphasis. I'm going to bring in a character and clean that up, and then we'll add some layers to this so that we can go in and color restore it. So I'm going to turn all of these eyeballs off so that we can't see these layers that I'm working with, and I'm just dealing with this background again. So I'm going to go up here to File, and I'm going to go to Open and Place and select my character. I'll go ahead and use this one. So I'm going to go ahead and click Open, and it will place it directly into my picture here. Okay, so I need to rotate this, clean it up, make it black and white, and then we'll go ahead and adjust it. But before we do that, make sure again that that layer is highlighted, and go up to Layer and Rasterize, and we need to rotate this, so we'll go to Edit, Transform, Rotate. I'll go ahead and rotate it around a little bit. And I'm going to leave it this size for now while I clean it up. And with the last composite, we took some time to talk about these different tools that we can use to clean this up. But I'm just going to go ahead and go through this really quick. And if you need to refer back to the other tutorial, go ahead and do it. I'm just going to use a big eraser here. And then I'll go in and start to select some different areas to delete using a magic wand. Alright, so I just kind of down and dirty cleaned this up with eraser tool. I used a lasso tool to lasso a few areas and went in with a magic wand to select some of the bigger areas. Now I need to go in and make this black and white as well. So I'll go to Image Adjustments, go down and click Black and White, click OK, and then I need this to stand out from my background a little bit. But let's go ahead and start turning some things back on. So I'll turn the sky back on, foreground and middle ground, and I'm going to move this character to a position that I think will work pretty well. I want to get it behind the foreground, so actually let's kind of like it right there. Now, some things about composites. So I've got this essentially pasted in here and cut out. I can adjust this composite in a lot of different ways. If I go up to File, or I'm sorry, Edit, and go down to my transformations. If I click Free Transform, I can grab this bounding box and I can flip-flop this from left to right. I can stretch it out, shrink it down, basically do anything that I want with it. Let me actually see how this looks flipped. Now I'm going to go ahead and keep it this way. If you want to keep the size ratio, if you want to constrain it, by the way, if you hold Shift, when you drag, it will keep everything in proportion. So you may want to do that depending on what you're working with. But I'm just going to go ahead and shrink this guy down a little bit so that I can see some negative space behind this character and this, I guess, the secondary area of emphasis, which is this rock, and then the sun back there too. So I'm just going to go ahead and place that character there, hit this check mark, or you can hit enter, and that free transform works really well. So edit and free transform. Another cool thing that I can do is to enhance it a little bit to make it stand out. I can double click here and I can put a layer style on it, and I can enhance the outside or the inside of the figure in a lot of different ways. So I can check this and put an outer glow on it. I can do a drop shadow, which doesn't really make sense with the shadow in perspective very well. I can actually go in and burn one, but that is an option there. I can click this stroke, and we use this in the last composite, but having a black line around it, let me go ahead and select it. Okay, having a black line around it will also show a bunch of the artifacts that I left over, so that's an option to I guess enhance it a bit more too. I'm going to go ahead and click that outer glow, double click here. I'm going to get rid of the yellow, select white, click OK, just so it stands out a little bit and brings a little bit of interest to it. Now I could go in and dodge and burn. Dodge is lightning areas. If I wanted to exaggerate that light source a little bit, and let me zoom in so you can see this a little bit better. So with dodge selected, as you click on areas, you can lighten those areas. So if I wanted to lighten one side of this figure's body to exaggerate a light source, I could do that. And I'm actually going to go through and dodge just a little bit here to accentuate some of the shading on this character. And then I can go in and I can burn. So I'm going to use this burn tool, and I can darken some areas on the figure if I want. To adjust or change your value, you can go up here from midtones to shadows or highlights, and the higher the exposure, the darker the burning is. I'm actually going to switch that over to 20% really quick, and I'm going to go into let me turn off the middle ground. I'm going to go into this foreground so that you can see this. I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to go ahead and burn in a shadow underneath this figure so that it looks a little bit more like that figure standing there in space. It's good to keep shadows, lights, and darks consistent to give the figure a little bit of weight. That will help out. And then I need to go back into the focal point or my figure and burn a couple of parts of that figure to stay consistent with the shadow that I just burnt. And I'm going to go ahead and click on this middle ground and turn it on because I'm going to burn a little bit back behind where his heel is. Okay, so that just sets him in space a little bit, and that's kind of a nuance thing, but you might be able to use that to your advantage to add some interest as well. So now I have this composition basically finished. I could consider this a finished work as is, or I could export this and print it and go in and hand color it with watercolors and then reinforce lines with pen and ink. That would be a really good option, especially if it's printed on a lightweight watercolor. But if I'm going to keep it digital, which in this case we're going to do that, I'm going to take all of these layers and I'm going to add some color to them. So since I have everything I guess, in its own layer, I'm going to start with turning off the layers that I don't want to work with first. I'm going to start with the sky, and I'm going to highlight that, and we're going to add some color to the sky. So to do that, I need to go down here, and I need to click this new layer button. And let me, I'm just going to go ahead and pull the focal, actually I'll leave the focal point there. So where it says layer 1, it's highlighted, and I'm going to type in blue, and I'm going to add some blue to that sky, and I'm actually going to add some yellow too for where the sun is too. But to get started, I'm going to select where it says sky. I'm going to go up to my magic wand. For tolerance, I'm going to type in 100%. And I'm going to click on that background, and notice that it selected essentially the entire background for me. Now I need to go back to that blue layer, and I'm going to fill that with a color blue, okay? And I don't even have to paint anything in here. I can just double click down here in my color picker, and I'll use this light blue, or I'm sorry, my color palette, and I'm going to go up here, and instead of gradient, actually I could use gradient, but I'm going to use the paint bucket. I'm going to click that layer, and it filled this layer in with blue. Now I want to go up to where it says normal and drop that down, and I'm going to use a blending mode. This blending mode works really well. Overlay, so I'm putting some blue over top of that sky essentially, or that background, and I can turn the opacity of it up or down. If I want to take some color away, I can do that, or I can always adjust the color a little bit later on. So I'm going to turn the opacity down a touch and leave that as is. I'm going to do the same thing for the middle ground and the foreground, so I'll turn my middle ground on. I'm going to create a layer, and I'm going to put that layer right on top of that middle ground, and I'm going to use, let's use brown for this. So I'll select the middle ground, use my magic wand, and I'm not going to use the magic wand. That doesn't look too good. I'm going to use, let's use the quick selection. So I'll just drag across the areas that I want with this quick selection tool. And fill that with a brown. So I'll double click down here in the palette, and let me find something that will work for me. Kind of like that. That brown. So I'll select that, click OK, go back to my paint bucket. Now I can fill that, and let me actually kind of like that. With the tolerance turned down, it didn't fill in every spot. I left some gray, but I'm going to go with it. You can always turn that up to 100% if you wanted to fill more. But let's go up to normal and go down to overlay and see how this is going to look. Let's see. Oh, I actually got it on the middle ground. So I'm going to go Command Z and step back through that. So I use the paint bucket and dump that onto my brown layer. Now I'll go up to where it says normal, click overlay, and overlay it over top of everything. I actually kind of liked the color in all those different spots too that were put on the middle ground. So I guess that's a good rule of thumb. If you like something, go with it. And I'm loving how that blue is starting to blend in a little bit, since this area is blurred and gives it some atmosphere. So I'm going to leave that how it is. Now I just want to take that foreground, click the layer, and add a color to it. And I'm going to do, I guess this is a good time to talk about color schemes and how to use color. So with just basics, with my background, I'm using a cool color because cool colors tend to recede. They go back in space. I'm going to use a neutral in the middle ground, and then I'm going to warm up this foreground just a touch. And I could add some accents, a little bit of green here and there, but I think I'm going to go with sort of a reddish brown. And again, I'm labeling everything just so I don't get out of place with the amount of layers that I'm starting to get built up. So let's take a look at perhaps a more reddish brown. Click OK. Take the paint bucket with reddish brown selected. Go ahead and click over top of that, and actually I skipped one step. So let me go back. I need to get that foreground area selected. So I'll just actually turn off everything so that I'm just working with these layers. So there's my foreground. So I'm going to select that foreground, and again, I can do that in a number of different ways. I can use the quick select tool though with it selected, and just clicking on it selects the whole thing. So I'll go up to this reddish brown layer and use my reddish brown color with the paint bucket. Click on that, switch from normal to overlay, and I'm going to bump the opacity down just a touch. And let's go ahead and turn everything on, see how we're doing here. And that actually looks pretty interesting, and I'm going to go ahead and go with that. And that created quite a bit of depth within the picture plane. The foreground's really in focus. We have a little bit of Gaussian blur in the middle ground and quite a bit in the background. And then I still have this figure here that I can go ahead and color restore as well, add any colors that I want to, so I can create a layer on top of that focal point. And on that layer I can just basically go in and paint. Let's say that I'm going to add some, actually I'll stick with that blue just for the demonstration's purposes. I can select my brush tool, and then I can go in and put blue on this layer anywhere I feel it would look good. So let me just go ahead and start to block in some blue on the body to separate some of the parts of the body. And obviously this looks like a coloring book. You could stick with opaque colors if you wanted to, but again, I like using those blending modes. And you can click through the different blending modes to see what they're going to give you. They all have kind of a different look, and you can again adjust the opacity if you want to pull some away. Now let's say that I'm painting and I like the blue that I'm laying down, but I want to experiment and try some different colors on here. I can always do that by double clicking my palette over here, or I can go up to the swatches if there's something specific that I want, maybe this green. I can go in and lay some of that in here as well. If you get to the point where you're like, I don't really like this, I'm not liking the colors, but you've filled in the areas, you've painted on the areas that need color, you can also go up to image adjustments, and if you go to hue and saturation, you can actually change that whole layer just by clicking or dragging the hue back and forth. And perhaps I want something that stands out a little bit more, so I'd go with the red and green. They contrast really nice, or this purple and blue, so on and so forth. So let's go ahead and leave it purple and blue, and I've got to turn the saturation down a bit because it was quite a bit of color on that figure. And I'll adjust the lightness just so we can see it just a touch better. And click OK, and I could consider this a finished piece. You'd obviously want to take your works a little bit farther, but just to, I guess, to kind of get started, that gives you the basics of how to color restore. I just want to add one last thing. So with this blue layer selected for the sky, if you select a different color and you go in with your brush and you start adding it, it will show up right over top of your other color that you've used. But once you get to the point where you want those things to blend a little bit, one nice little hack is to use this flow, and I can turn this flow down, and now when I brush, I got turned up a little bit so that it works a little bit faster. Now when I brush, you can see that it's just adding a little bit at a time. So if I do want to blend things out, I can turn that down quite a bit and just add a touch of color to kind of blend things out. That way it doesn't look so harsh. And I may actually leave some of these dashes because I like that look. All right, so again, that gets you started with bringing in a background, separating it with a foreground, middle ground, background. Remember to blur things down as they go back into space. Bring in some type of a focal point. You can adjust that any way you want. And then for the color restoration side of it, I'd be as detailed as you possibly can. Again, this is kind of a sloppy image put together, but it will allow you to have some tools at your disposal to convey those concepts you're trying to convey. When you're finished, always remember to go to File and save this as a PSD, a Photoshop document. If you're working with Photoshop, you can go back and forth between Photopea and Photoshop, but always keep that Photoshop document. That will keep all of the layers intact, so you can go in and make adjustments. It will not keep your history, but you will have all of the layers that you're working with.